are familiar with, and the one that we really mark with more extreme pronouncement, and it's much more amplified. Be'achad b'tishrei, Rosh Hashanah l'shanim ulashmitin. So that is the new year that we are most familiar with. Of course, that's what we colloquially say is Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah. And then Be'achad B'Shvat, which is of course what we're going to focus on tonight, not accidentally is this thoughtfully designed, even though we don't hold like Beit Shammai, that it's the first of the month. It's actually in fact celebrated and marked on the 15th of the month. But nonetheless, the 2 days are marked and are appropriately marked by the Talmudic discussion. Be'achad b'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah li'ilan. So we take a step back and we look at the formulation and the formation of the different types of New Year's, the different types of touch points, not just the fact that they exist, but qualitatively, what are we highlighting? What are we demonstrating? What are the areas of focus? What are the areas that are being magnified in order to be able to extract that idea of newness and marry it to a certain category, or marry it to a certain mindfulness, or marry it to a certain point of intention that that particular day marks. So as we focus in, and we're going to come back to this point a number of times, there's a very almost nuanced distinction that's brought down in this sugya. It says Be'achad b'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah l'shanim, right? So that's when we mark the new year, and that's when we flip over to the next numerical year. But the end of that, it says L'nitzi'ah. So we actually also mark the planting, which is interesting because then we have a separate new year to mark the product of that initial planting. So it's important to note that there's almost a sensitivity and a nuance that the Talmud is grabbing our attention to understand that we are supposed to see those as two separate elements. We're supposed to see those as two different gestational periods, that there's an element and a time for planting and also a time for the outcome of that product and for celebrating trees. So it's interesting. And again, we'll come back to that point later on about why we're marking both of those. So when we take a step back and again, we look at this sugya, there are a number of questions that arise. Why 4? What are the 4 different dimensions that are being highlighted? And for us specifically tonight, to be able to focus in and hone in on the relationship between newness and trees and what the uniqueness of that relationship is meant to help us understand and underscore about Tu B'Shvat, and again, more importantly, about the learnings and the extraction that can be applied to our day-to-day lives. Okay. So very famously, this is a statement from Sefer Devarim, and it says as follows: Ki tatzur el ha'ir yamim rabim lihilachem alaha letafsa lo tashchit et etzel lindoach alav garzen ki mimenu tochal va'oto lo tichrot. Okay, so I'll translate in a moment, but the real crux and the epicenter and the crown jewel of that pasuk is a statement that many are familiar with, Ki Adam Eitz Hasadeh, because man is a tree of the field. Now, the question is, and there are many different commentators that raise this, are we talking, is this metaphoric, that man is like a tree of the field? Is this literal, that man is a tree of the field? And what exactly are we supposed to understand about this bilateral relationship that has been superimposed in this particular pasuk? And the pasuk continues, interestingly, and which we'll talk about in a moment as well. Rak eitz asher teda, ki lo eitz ma'achal hu ota tashlit bekarata. So here, the Torah is telling us that there are certain types of trees that cannot be destroyed. Al ha'ir asher hi osa imcha milchama ad ridata. And you may cut certain trees down, but essentially a tree that bears fruit, and this is the outcome, will not be allowed to be cut down. Now, there are many different explanations for this and almost colloquial punchlines that are drawn from this in terms of like fruit of the tree, fruit of my labor, that like the idea and the analogies that are colloquially and culturally reinforced are actually drawn and born from this parallelism that is induced in this pasuk about Ki Adam Eitz Hasadeh and the aftermath and the outcome of what that means vis-a-vis the relationship between mankind and trees. So the question is, again, multi-layered, and all of this will again filter back to that initial Talmudic discussion that we just saw and looked at. So Ki Adam Eitz Hasadeh, metaphoric, physical, we don't yet know. And there's also an element about certain types of trees that are allowed to be used for certain things, but a tree specifically that yields fruit cannot be destroyed. So the question is why? And I want to look at that from the perspective of a sugya that actually has nothing to do with this pasuk at all, but can hopefully help shed light on what this relationship is between man and tree, and specifically man and fruit, and as fruit as a point of produce or point of outcome from the tree. So we'll do this one together in English. Rabbi Yochanan ben Shaul said, "For what reason did the Torah say to bring a heifer?" Here's talking about the Egla Arufa, whose neck is broken to a stream. So just a little bit of backstory and information. So here, in a particular scenario where a corpse is found between two cities, and the person's identity is unknown, we don't know what happened to the person, that there's a whole process measuring and where this person, who is responsible to take care of this person. This is the whole concept of Egla Arufa. So in this very interesting set of laws, which we don't have time to go into tonight, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, "Let something that did not produce fruit," i.e., meaning this Egla Rufa that has not given birth, "come and have its neck be broken at a stream that flows forcefully," which is a place that does not produce fruit. So we're taking an animal that has not produced fruit, and we are metaphorically, symbolically applying that, placing that, juxtaposing that to a stream that's flowing forcefully, which too also cannot produce fruit because of the force, because of the nature of where it's being placed. And what's it going to do? Those two elements atone for the murder of one who was not given an opportunity to produce fruit. So here, as part of this Talmudic discussion, there's an influence and an understanding about what has been deprived, and what has been deprived from that person. What are we missing from the potential of that person's life? And we are going to echo those sentiments as expressed through the animal and as expressed through the geographic point where this whole entire episode is going to take place. And what we're doing is we're marrying all of these three elements together: the death of this animal that never bared fruit, to the death of the stream, meaning something that can't supply life, to now a person who will never have the opportunity to produce fruit. Now, again, it's not accidental. This thoughtful curation about this production of fruit, a fruit producing tree, these are not just incidental metaphors, that these are really talking about and underscoring deep, powerful, foundational insights about the relationship between man and tree, between humankind and earth, or humankind and trees, and of course the fruit that it produces. So the Gemara asks, we're continuing in the bottom here, about halfway through the Gemara on the bottom. The Gemara asks, what is this fruit that he was not given an opportunity to produce? Like, what are we actually talking about here? What are we talking about? Real fruit? What are we talking about? If we say it refers to being fruitful and multiplying, that the killer prevented him from not having more children, if that's so, what about the case where a person wasn't going to have children? So it wasn't an element of having this as a child output. This wasn't about cutting down someone's life before they were able to have children. We're talking about a case where that wasn't going to happen. So what are we talking about? And it continues, so too you will say that we do not break the heifer's neck because they could not have had any more children, even had they lived, rather that the fruit of our mitzvot. So here, the Gemara is intuiting and inciting and helping us understand and connect that there's an element of fruit that parallels the notion of mitzvot, that the outcome, what we produce, what we interact with, who we interact with, how we shape that identity, and the intersection that takes place in terms of the relationship with the world, fruit being that produce or that end product, that's going to be the expression of our values. That's going to be an expression of who we are. So the first element that we're looking at, and the first stage or the first insight that we can derive from using these two sources together, and really using Masechet Sota to help filter up through the source of in Sefer Devarim about Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh. Why can't we cut down fruit trees and use the wood? Because we're leaving something on the table, because we are not allowing the full potential of that product to then be exercised. And from a perspective of not being wasteful, A, from the negative perspective, and then B, from the perspective of not extracting potential, that is one of the greatest crimes, to not allow potential to blossom, to not allow potential to be extracted, to not allow potential to be used, to be cultivated, and to be calibrated for good. So when we look at the perspective of mitzvot, we have denied that person that interaction with the world. We've denied that person the ability to have mitzvot as the conduit with how they interact with the world. So it's again, similar to the source in Devarim, Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh, we don't ever want to use something that has the ability to be more and to settle for less. This is a nod that we don't settle for less. When there's potential, when there's opportunity, when there's something that we can conquer, something that we can overcome, we never settle for less. So this is that first insight, and that's the insight of potential and the perspective that through this metaphor and through this marriage and through this Talmudic curation and rabbinic curation and the Torah's curation of the connection between man and tree, that first element is to see that they are inextricably connected because of the power of potential that both of them represent. They can grow, they can expand, and they can become, and they can produce. Those are words that can easily be used to define trees, and those are clearly words that can easily be used to define the human condition. And the relationship goes back even further. And we're going to take it one step further now, beyond the realm of potential, and look at what that next iteration is. So we're going back really to the source of all sources, to the story of creation. So on the day that God created heaven and earth, what happens? All of the elements, all of the aspects of creation that God created, that God supplied to the world and put everything in place ready to rock, Lo himtir Hashem Elokim al haaretz va'adam ayin la'avodat ha'adama. Nothing yet worked because God had not sent rain upon earth. Not just that, and there was no person to work the soil. So already kind of as a hint and as this wisdom that was embedded and threaded through the human condition, there is also this inextricable link between man and earth. And there's linguistic connections, the fact that Adam is from Adama. We can spend an hour just on that topic alone about man's connection with, or human beings' connection with earth itself. But here, this is taking potential to the next level, because the first two sources, or that first element, their first foray into this metaphor and this relationship between man and tree is couched from the perspective of potential. But now, according to Bereishit, we're saying potential is not even good enough, because potential can be dormant. Potential is useless unless it is activated. So what happens? It's not until the eight element haaretz v'hishka et kol pnei adama. We're in pasuk Gimel here. Vayitzar Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min adama vayipach b'apav nishmat chayim. So what happens? God breathes a breath of His soul. He activates the system. He not only is it now potential, but now it's been activated and it's been catalyzed. Vayihi adam lenefesh chaya, and man becomes this living, vibrant being that is imbued with the essence of God. But what happens next? And the next word is so telling. Vayita Hashem Elokim gan be'edem mikenda vayasam sham et ha'adam asher yatzar. So God planted this Garden of Eden, and the word vayita is not, again, accidental. This is a thoughtful verb to help us not only understand the meaning, but to understand the purpose of what this element of creation was and what man's role, what humankind's role is in that space. It is to be planted in the space, because unless we are planted in, we can't then activate the entire system to extract the ability, the capability that lies dormant within. So the first element is potential, and the second element is activation of that potential. And if we don't, then we're leaving too much on the table. There's too much that's been that's been left out to dry, and not enough that has been extracted, that has been cultivated, and that has been supplied, and in turn renewed or reinforced to be able to re-engage with the world. So if we continue along this line of thinking, so again, just to review, we've got area number one, which is potential, area number two, which is activation of that potential, and we need to keep those separate. Because number one, there are different stages in the development of each. And number two, going back to the Gemara in the beginning, we are informed halachically, philosophically, and pedagogically that planting and product are two different stages. When we have Rosh Hashanah, Nitiyah is included in that. The notion of planting, the notion of potential is literally and figuratively seeded into that space. But now that's not enough. We need to have a separate point in the year to mark the product, to mark the expansion, to mark the development, to mark that cultivation. So it's important that we see that in its two separate stages and not lump it together, because even in lumping it together, we're going to miss the nuances that help us curate and extract the value that is uniquely involved in each of those attributes, one of planting and then the act of becoming. I always think about how we are called human beings, but we are also human becomings. That hasn't really taken on so much. Nobody else uses that terminology, but there's human beings and there's human becomings. And we are constantly toggling between both of those worlds, trying to be and present and mindful, and at the same time, relentlessly curious and hungry to grow. And we're constantly toggling between those two. And there's a reason that, again, even Talmudically, those two ideas are left apart: seeds and extraction, or the potential of growth and the growth itself. Let's take a look over here in Sefer Devarim. It says as follows: so follow none other, only God you should follow. You should follow and observe his mitzvot, and listen to his voice. So on this pasuk, and we should, right, so worship him and cleave to him and stick to God, and really beautiful phraseology and terminology. And the Vayikra Rabbah says as follows, interestingly and beautifully: Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Simon Patach. Okay, so we're gonna darshan this pasuk. We're going to look at the explanation and the extraction and the meaning and the understanding of what this verse is actually talking about. Like, let's be honest, is it real that we can go after? Is that possible that we can pursue God and walk after God? And it quotes a pasuk here. We're gonna skip over some of the phrases here. Right? You're supposed to go after God. And you're supposed to stick to God. Right? We're all supposed to ascend to heaven and cleave to God. Like, is that really possible? Vayikra Rabbah is trying to help us understand, what exactly is it? Again, is this metaphoric? Is this physical? Is this practical? Is this metaphysical? Is it philosophical? What are the different elements of the pasuk that will help us understand what it truly means to be part of and to be connected to God? And the Gemara and the Vayikra Rabbah continues as follows, and it says, "Ela mitchilat briyato shel olam, lo nitasek hakadosh baruch hu ela b'matzat tchila." How do we understand God? We mimic God. We're created in the image of God. We're created with the breath of God. I always think about how, if there are any yogis in the house, that the Ujjayi breath is often thought about as that like deep nostril breath. And when you actually make the sound, there's like the swirling element that actually echoes part of creation. And I always think about how, in yoga, you've got tree pose, and that's not accidental either, that there are clearly elements that are cultural, that have cultural relevance, that are part of these points of extraction or these points of differentiation, to help us cleave onto those ideas and those anchor points of understanding. How do we understand? Ella b'matzat tchila, we have to learn to plant. Why? Vayitah Hashem Elokim b'gan Eden. Because that's what God did first. There's creation, there's potential, there's possibility, there are seeds of what can be. When does it become something? When can it actually activate? When does it actually root itself? Vayitah Hashem Elokim b'gan Eden. When we learn how to plant, we will understand what it means to cleave to God. We will understand Acharei Hashem Telechu. We will understand Ubotit Bakun. When we put our hands in the ground, when we plant, when we understand what that means, we will start to have an inkling to understand the relationship between God and humanity. And that relationship will be expressed through humankind understanding their relationship to the earth, and specifically their relationship to trees. And it quotes the end here. You have to go. That's the first portal of engagement, the first gateway to pass through, is that we have to learn how to plant first. Because when you get into the land of Israel, which we'll look at a source at in just a moment, when you get into the land of Israel, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to plant. Source number 1 on this page, Avot Rabbi Natan, a magnificent, telling storyline that helps us concretize and anchor our thoughts and these teachings into the most extraordinary soundbite. If you have planting in your hands, right? You're planting whatever it is. Basil's a big one in our home now, right? So you're planting something. And somebody comes and you say, Mashiach is here. the long-awaited we wait day after day after day, and we pray all the time for and hope and breathe for the existence of Mashiach and for the coming of Mashiach. Here Mashiach arrives. What do we say? One moment, please. You first finish planting, and afterwards you go out and you greet Mashiach. So interesting. It stands in such stark contrast to when, or actually, in a very interesting kind of reverse parallelism, where you have Abraham that leaves the Shekhinah to go take care of Hachnasat Orachim. So here we're saying, Mashiach, you wait a minute because I have to finish planting. So the emphasis being placed on planting, the emphasis on engaging in that activity is something that is intuiting and that is processing, that there's almost a part of that supersedes Mashiach itself, that supersedes some element of redemption. If we want to understand redemption, if we want to catalyze redemption, we need to understand the value of planting. And these ideas are reinforced again in Sefer Shemot. The words tivi'emo v'tita'emo. This is when we're crossing the Yam Suf in the magnificent Shira, and this gorgeous expression and poetic demonstration in song and in dance that we're expressing our gratitude to God. What do we say? Tivi'emo v'tita'emo. You bring me and you plant me. I need to be planted. I need to be rooted. I need to be firm, because when I understand that I am Eitz HaSadeh, ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh, that's part of my legacy, that's part of my future, which we'll get to in a moment, then we can start to underscore and understand the value that is inextricably linked in our relationship with God. And this is again reinforced in Sefer Vayikra, v'chitavo al haaretz, and this is what the source before mentioned on the prior page, v'chitavo al haaretz u'netatem kol eitz ma'achal, right? And what do we have? If we think about many of the mitzvot that are connected to the land of Israel have to do with produce. It's about Arla, and it's about, in the Shemitah year where you're allowed to do, not allowed to do, planting, and all of the different elements that come along with having to give or having to share, having to contribute, all come down to the produce, what we are producing. We are producers of. We are not just takers, we are active participants and then active suppliers back to the world. Okay, I'm just going to read over a couple of quick sources. I'm mindful of time. I'm just going to read over a couple of other interesting sources that can hopefully help kind of envelop this idea of this next iteration of the extraction of potential. So again, areas number one is the potential of humankind vis-a-vis the relationship between the metaphor of the tree, number one, and number two, actually engaging in the planting and the extraction of that value. Right? So we know that when the Jewish people were traveling through the desert, everything was supplied for them. Whatever they needed was given to them. That has to do with part of the socio-cultural makeup of the Jewish people at the time, beyond the scope of tonight, but that everything was literally handed to them. You want water, you've got your be'er. You want food, you've got your man. You want your protection, you have your ananei hakavod. Everything that you need to have, you're going to have. But what happens when you get into the land of Israel? It's not about being takers, it's about being contributors. It's about anchoring, rooting ourselves in potential, in capability, and then extracting that capability. And that is expressed through the mandate, kitavo el haaretz u'netatem, because when you get to the land of Israel, you must plant. And it goes back to the story of creation. That is the point of departure. And that's the point that we need to constantly be able to reference back to, that it's about planting, the understanding of the potential, and then activating that through the art and through the engagement of planting. And we'll just look at a couple final sources here. Also in Sefer Devarim, Vayishkon Yisrael betach badad. So interestingly, and I find this phrase particularly jarring in the intersection in the world in which we find ourselves now, when it says that Israel dwells securely, and it's interesting that the word badad is used there, implying that there's an element of alone, which is interesting to think about the isolation factor, and yet that isolation is also juxtaposed to security, that sometimes it is in that place of aloneness, the place of oneness with self, that we're actually able to find what betach really truly means, and to be able to find that sanctity and that protection from isolation and from the space of sometimes being alone, which is beyond the scope of what we're going to cover tonight and what we are covering tonight, but really rings true, I think, this year more than others, and namely for Tu B'Shvat, because this was really the last holiday that we celebrated in a different world. So already by Purim last year, we were all in a different place. This was really the last part of the calendar, the holiday calendar, that we celebrated this in a different fashion. And I think about that word badad that has this jarring resonance, particularly right now. And then Rashi on that pasuk says, what does it mean? Kol yachid v'yachid, every individual, which is magnificent. Rashi's intuition to understand we're talking about yachidim here, that there are elements where we are part of and mitzaref in the greater and the broader community. And there are incredible platforms that help us extract the value of that. Things like Zoom, things like, getting together and having opportunities to learn together. But here, kol yachid v'yachid, ish tachat gafno v'tachat te'inato. Each person is living and dwelling in the security, in the shade, and under the protection of the vine under the fig tree. Again, these are products of planting. Those things are only possible if it's rooted. We don't have access to that output. We don't have access to that outcome without first having the planting. And I want to look at one final category. So we have number one, where there is the potential. That's nitiyah versus the ilan, in terms of the breakup of how the Gemara categorizes both. Number two is about taking that next step to actually plant and immerse ourselves in the act of rooting, because that is going to be what allows us to produce, to be producers, to be contributors, and at the same time to be protected in our oneness or aloneness by those virtues that stabilize us, which is the rooting of ourselves. And the third one is about the future. And this is a very, very famous Talmudic sugya, and it says as follows. The Gemara relates another story about Choni HaMa'agal. Okay, so our famous Choni. Rabbi Yochanan said, all the days of the life of that righteous man, Choni, he was distressed over the meaning of the verse. What was the verse that made him distressed? It's always interesting when there are rabbinic figures or sages that become distressed over certain statements. Shir hama'alot b'shuv Hashem shivat zion hayinu kecholme. So this not only has a presence, this statement has a presence for many of us on a weekly basis, but the bothersome aspect of this, Amar mi'ika, right? So here, sorry, we're going to continue together in English, and it says, like, are we talking about who are the dreamers? Destruction? Exile, annihilation. So here, Choni HaMa'agal is looking at the trajectory of exile, the 70-year exile, or intuiting about the Babylonian exile that's going to be taking place, or that is taking place. And he says, who is this? Who are these dreamers? What are we actually dreaming for? How is it possible to compare the 70-year exile in Babylonia to a dream? That's not a dream. One day, Choni is walking along the road when he saw a certain man planting a carob tree. Choni said to him, this tree, after how many years will it bear fruit? The man said to him, it will not produce fruit until 70 years have passed. Choni said to him, it is obvious to you that you will live 70 years and you expect to benefit from this tree. So here, this is not just a conversation. This is a mental sparring about this philosophical struggle that we have with struggle, and the struggle that we have with pain, the struggle that we have with challenge, when we are in places where we don't see the fruit of our labor, where we are in situations that are devastating, when we are in situations where we can't necessarily see the light at the tunnel. So what happens? Choni sat and, just as my ancestors planted for me, this is the response, so too I am planting for my descendants, right? We are part of this inextricable link of the cycle of life, that I am both the beneficiary of the past and the contributor to the future. I think it was Walt Disney who said that we're borrowing the world from our children, so we need to leave it intact for them. Choni sat and ate bread. Sleep overcame him and he slept. A cliff formed around him and he disappeared from sight and slept for 70 years. Again, the motif of 70 coming up over and over again. When he awoke, he saw a certain man gathering carobs from that tree. Choni said to him, are you the one who planted this tree? The man said to him, I am his son's son. So here we see, through the story and through this understanding, through planting and through produce and through the production, the fruit of the labor of the tree, this promise to the future. Because even if we are rooting, even if we are extracting potential and doing what we can be doing, there's an element of trust for the future. There's an element of trust that I might not see the produce today, but if I'm doing this with emunah, if I'm doing this with conviction, if I'm doing this process of planting with belief and with hope, then I know that I'm seeding something for the future. And these three elements, even though they are apart, so we've got the potential, the activation of potential, and hope for the future. These three elements are magnificently born out of this metaphor between man and tree. And I want to share one final element or one final story. And it's from my experience working at the World Trade Center. After the devastation of the attacks of 9/11, I was part of the rebuilding of the World Trade Center. I spent 8 years leading the retail development of that project. And there are many, hundreds and hundreds of stories to tell, and hundreds of stories that are still untold. There is a tree. If anybody's been to the World Trade Center campus, there is a tree. It's called the Survivor Tree. After the attacks of 9/11, when they were cleaning up, when the teams were cleaning up the rubble, they found one tree in devastating condition, but alive. And they took the tree and they brought it to a nursery to try to revive it. And the tree started to regrow, and the tree was reborn. And the tree was brought back into the World Trade Center campus and was perched right in middle, more or less between the two pools, which was the original site of the two towers. And every year, the tree looks like this during winter. And every year, the tree looks like this during the spring season and into the summer season. It wasn't until I saw this tree, it wasn't until we were working on the process of bringing this tree back, until the notion of Tu B'Shvat really hit home. We are marking and we're celebrating at the darkest time of year. We're not celebrating trees in their full bloom. We're not celebrating humankind in our full bloom. We're hibernating, we're closed, badad. We're experiencing that element of badad, referencing the pasuk in Devarim. We are badad more than we ever imagined or could have possibly imagined for ourselves to be badad. And yet, that is the moment when we catalyze newness. That's the moment that we mark and we say, no, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan. This is the time to celebrate that there is potential. This is the time to take broken pieces and say that this can be something and that we can replant, we can be reborn, we can produce, and we can become. And this timing of being able to have that conversation, especially with a dark tunnel, and all of us are experiencing this in different ways now, a dark tunnel ahead, please God, a horizon, a sun beaming horizon in the future, but still within this dark frame. And when we come to this time of year, we have a relentless obsession with renewal. We have a relentless obsession with future. We have a relentless obsession with cultivating, with calibrating, with building, with extracting, and with replanting. It's something that is part of our DNA. It is coded into us from the beginning of creation. Vayita Hashem, God plants. And God puts man, God puts humankind into that intersection of planting. Ki Adam Eitz Hasadeh. Because the more we understand how to take broken pieces, the more we understand how to take those pieces and to replant them, to regrow them, and to look at what we can become. So I hope for all of us that this Tu B'Shvat, we're able to see and to understand these different elements, the element of potential, the element of planting that potential, and at the same time, having our eyes set on the belief and the hope for the future, and to be able to mark that moment in the darkest time and realize and hope that the budding and the blossoming is something that will be able to spark and to be able to grow within. Thank you so much.
Amen. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much again for sharing this beautiful tour of us. It's very inspiring, and wow, that's the word I want. It was amazing. Thank you so much. We have now opportunities for questions. Please use the chat bar to ask any questions, and Rachel will happily answer them. We'll wait a few more minutes. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Keeping an eye.
Okay, it's fine. It's option. Okay, great. So no questions, but that's good. That's good too. That's excellent. Okay, so Rachel, thank you so much again for being with us tonight. I want to thank each participant for being with us tonight as well. It's great that TRM that we have these opportunities once a month to feature a scholar in residence, and this time it was Rachel Kraus. So thank you so much. Before we formally end, I just want to also give the opportunity to share with you that we started a weekly shir on Wednesday at 11 a.m. with Dr. Isaac Chevelle. We just received an email where you can click on the link to receive the sources beforehand. So without further ado, thank you so much again. And Rachel, please send our warmest regards to your family. And we all look forward to staying in touch. And hopefully, as you pointed out at the beginning of your shir, we'll have the opportunity to host you in person as well. So
Thank you so much for
all
having
the
me.
best.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thank you.
Rachel.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Tina.
Bye. Bye. It was terrific. Terrific.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.